So there is another filter. There are actually two other filters that we need, but the next filter that we need is a filter that's gonna trigger whenever the authentication fail, right? So if they try to do something and they have not authenticated at all, there's a forbidden entry point that's gonna be triggered. So we don't necessarily have to override it. We can just let it happen and it'll just send some message back to the user saying, hey, your request can't be, you don't have access to this or you're not authenticated. But it's always best to, override it and then make it look pretty and send a very nice response to the user. So that's what we're going to be doing. It's like a handler for whenever the authentication fail. So let's go ahead and create that filter. So in the same filter package, I'm gonna go to new and filter, and this is gonna be called the JWT authentication entry point. Okay, entry point. And the reason I'm calling it entry point is because it's gonna extend the HTTP 403 forbidden entry point, because if you're not authenticated, then you don't have access to it. It's a 403 forbidden. So let's go here and extend the HTTP. So HTTP 403 forbidden entry point. Okay, so we have to extend this class here, because whenever the user fails to provide authentication and they try to access the application, this gets fired, and it's got a default implementation for it with some very generic message, and we don't want that to happen. We want to take control over what gets sent back to the user. So that's why we have to actually implement this. So now we have to override one of the method of this. So if we go in there, you can see that it calls this always return 403 code to the client. Okay, so it's gonna return pre-authentication entry point call, blah blah blah, access denied. Okay, because you are not authenticated and you're trying to access the application, so it's gonna send this response to the user, which is very generic. Look, access denied. Okay, so we have to take control of that. So that means we have to override this method, because whenever this happens, then it's gonna go ahead and trigger this commence method. So we can just copy this method and then go back to our entry point and then paste it there. So here we don't need all of this. Let's remove this if statement and let's format this a little bit better. So as you can see, it takes a request, response, and the authentication exception. So I'm just gonna call this exception, not argument 2, exception. Okay, so what we have to do now is to just take this response and then generate a very standard application response to the user. We can leave it like that. As you can see, it's fine, it works fine, we have no errors. It will still send this error response to the user, but we don't want that to happen. So what we have to do now, you remember, let's go back here and go to the domain. We created this, oops, cancel. So we created this response, right? You remember, with a status code, reason, and a message. So we're gonna go ahead and use it now, because that's gonna be the standard way of sending an HTTP response to the users. So let's go to our class, which is the entry point. Let's just create a new object of this. So HTTP response, HTTP response. And let's see if we can import that. Import class, and that's coming from our domain, not java.net. And then we're gonna do new HTTP response, and then we're gonna pass in whatever we want. Remember, this is forbidden. So because it's forbidden, then we can just go ahead and just build it very easily. So let's go ahead and do HTTP status. So HTTP status from Spring dot forbidden. Oops. Forbidden. Okay, as you can see here. So you remember the first thing in this class, right? If we go back, you can see the first thing is an HTTP status code, and it's an integer. So what we have to do in the forbidden is to just get the value. The value, if you go click in there, you'll see it's just the int, which represent the actual value of the status code. So if it's like okay, it's going to be like 200. Okay, so let's go back and then we get the value for that. So the next thing we need is the actual HTTP status. As you can see, it's giving me HTTP status as the next argument. So I can just do this and just pass it in here. HTTP status. Next argument is going to be the actual reason phrase. So we can take the reason phrase from here. So HTTP status forbidden dot get reason phrase. Okay, so that's gonna give us, I'm gonna put this on a new line. So that's gonna give us the reason phrase, which is a string. And then lastly, actually, let me turn this to uppercase. So let's do to uppercase so that it can always be uppercase. And then we also need to pass in the actual message, which in our case would be the forbidden message. So let's do security constant and then that forbidden message. And there it is. So let me see if I can do some static import. So I went ahead and then just do static import for the forbidden from HTTP status, and now this looks a lot nicer. So you can see we created our object here, new HTTP response, which is our custom class, and we pass in the forbidden value, the forbidden phrase, the reason phrase, and we change it to uppercase, and then we pass in our own message. And you can see, you'll see how this is gonna be like really pretty when we start using the application. So now we just have to pass it to the actual response, which is this guy right here, which is gonna be ultimately passed to the user. So I'm gonna remove all of this, and then bring this back up, and then the response, we have to set the content. So let's do set the content type in here, and we're just gonna have to do application.json file because we're returning JSON, and we want it to come from not MIME type from us. We want it to come from HTTP, not the util. Okay, so we set the content of the response, the content type, to application.json, and then now we have to set the actual status on the response. So let's do response and set status. Of course, you already know this is gonna be this, which is the status. So the forbidden, if you go there, this is the status, the forward 3. So once you call the value on that, I just showed you that it gives you the actual number of the actual HTTP response or the phrase. And then once we get the status, at this point we can just create an output stream and then map the actual object, which is this response. As you can see, this response is not being used yet. We're still working with this response, which is the HTTP servlet response, but this response is our object. If we leave it like this, we won't see any of this information that we just set. We won't see it because only this response, which is the HTTP servlet response, is being returned. So we have to find a way to take that response and then stream this object into it, and that's what we need to do. So at this point we can just call an output stream and then map this. So let's do output stream from Java IO, and let's just call it output stream, and we can just pass in the response and we can get the output stream and the response. So now that we have the stream, we can just map it. So we can call the object mapper. So object mapper, and that's coming from JaxRX. So we call it mapper, and then here we can just create a new object mapper, and then here what we have to do is just to write those values in the mapper. So we can call the mapper and call the right value on it. So write the value, and that's just gonna take the actual stream, so the output stream, and it's gonna take the actual value, which is this, and then we pass it in here, and then now all we have to do is just flush it. So flush, and we should be good to go. Okay, so again, I think I have to allow this. I don't know why this is happening. So it says static import is giving me an error, and then I have to say allow. Hopefully there's a configuration to just not have to deal with that. I'm just gonna remove those and use import and clear this up a little bit. So the reason this is still like dark because it's not being used yet, but it'll be like blue like this once it's being used. So again, if there's the user is not authenticated and they try to access the application, okay, this gets triggered. Actually, I have to override this. So here I have to put at override because that's exactly what we're doing from Java language. Okay, so this is gonna be triggered. Okay, and if you can go in there and you'll see you'll say access denied because you're not logged in. So we're just overriding this method so that we can send a very nice message to the user, which is what we discussed in the beginning. So once this gets fired, it will call this method. And since we overrided, instead of calling this one in this class, which is the default, it will call ours. And then ours will just do all this work and then return the response to the user. And you will see this response. We will test everything in Postman and you will see how this looks, and you can see why it's very important to keep your code clean and your response very consistent when you're building a REST API.